The morning started like any other Tuesday in downtown Atlanta. Cars honked their horns in the busy streets, while people rushed to work carrying their coffee cups. The old courthouse stood tall against the clear blue sky as Marcus Thompson walked up the stone steps. He was 32 years old and worked as a youth basketball coach at the local community center. His dark suit was freshly pressed, and his shoes were polished to a perfect shine. Marcus had received a traffic ticket 3 weeks ago that he knew was a mistake. The officer claimed he ran a red light at the corner of Peachtree and 5th Street, but Marcus was certain the light was yellow when he passed through. He had even found a nearby security camera that proved his innocence. Today was his day in court, and he felt confident about clearing his name. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning provided relief from the Georgia heat. Marcus passed through the metal detector and followed the signs to courtroom 3. The hallway smelled like old books and floor polish. Other people waited on wooden benches outside various courtrooms, some looking nervous and others just bored. Marcus found an empty spot and sat down to review his documents one more time. At exactly 9:30, a bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors to courtroom 3. People filed in quietly and took their seats on the hard wooden benches. The room had high ceilings and large windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. The American flag stood in one corner while the Georgia state flag stood in the other. Everything about the room seemed designed to make people feel small and reminded them of the serious nature of the law. Marcus chose a seat in the 3rd row on the left side. He noticed the diverse mix of people around him. An elderly white woman clutched her purse tightly. A young Hispanic man in work clothes checked his phone repeatedly. A middle-aged black woman tried to quiet her restless toddler. Everyone had their own story and their own reason for being there that morning. The courtroom gradually filled up as more cases were scheduled. Marcus counted at least 40 people in the gallery. Some were defendants like him, while others appeared to be family members or witnesses. A few people in suits carrying briefcases were clearly lawyers. Everyone spoke in hushed whispers as if afraid to disturb the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. Marcus had been to court only once before in his life when he served as a character witness for a friend. That experience had been quick and straightforward. The judge had been fair and professional, treating everyone with respect. Marcus expected today would be similar. He would present his evidence, explain his side of the story, and hopefully leave with the ticket dismissed. He thought about his family waiting at home. His wife Sheila was probably getting their 2 kids ready for school right now. 8-year-old Jasmine would be arguing about which dress to wear, while 6-year-old Darius would be trying to sneak extra cookies into his lunchbox. Marcus smiled thinking about them. He coached basketball not just for the paycheck, but because he genuinely loved working with kids and making a positive difference in their lives. The court clerk entered through a side door and began organizing papers at her desk. She was a thin woman with glasses who moved with practiced efficiency. Marcus watched as she prepared for the morning session, checking her computer and arranging files. Everything seemed routine and orderly. In just a few minutes, the judge would enter, and the proceedings would begin. Marcus had no idea that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become one of the most extraordinary days of his life. The side door opened, and Judge Patricia Hawkins entered the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps. Everyone stood up as the bailiff announced her arrival. She was a woman in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. Her black robe swirled around her as she climbed the steps to her elevated bench. She sat down heavily in her large leather chair and surveyed the room with cold blue eyes. Judge Hawkins had been serving on the bench for 15 years. Those who worked in the courthouse knew her reputation well. She ran her courtroom with an iron fist and had little patience for what she called nonsense. Court staff often whispered about her harsh sentences and quick temper. Some lawyers tried to avoid having cases assigned to her courtroom whenever possible. The morning session began with the usual formalities. The court clerk read the docket listing all the cases scheduled for that day. Judge Hawkins shuffled through papers on her desk, barely looking up. She seemed particularly irritated this morning, though no one knew why. Maybe she had fought with her husband at breakfast, or perhaps her arthritis was acting up again. Whatever the reason, her mood cast a dark cloud over the entire courtroom. Marcus watched as the first few cases were called. A young man pleaded guilty to shoplifting and received community service. An older woman contested a parking ticket and lost. Judge Hawkins dealt with each case, quickly showing little interest in the details. She cut people off when they tried to explain themselves and rolled her eyes at their excuses. Her demeanor made everyone in the room feel uncomfortable. The judge had developed certain habits over the years that court regulars recognized. She would tap her pen impatiently when someone spoke too slowly. She would sigh loudly when she thought someone was wasting her time. Sometimes she would mutter comments under her breath that only the court reporter could hear. These behaviors had gotten worse lately, causing concern among courthouse staff. Behind her stern exterior, Judge Hawkins carried personal frustrations that influenced her work. Her son had recently lost his job and moved back home. Her husband spent most evenings at the country club playing golf with his friends. She felt unappreciated both at home and at work. These feelings often bubbled to the surface during court proceedings, affecting how she treated the people who appeared before her. The courthouse had received several complaints about Judge Hawkins over the past 2 years. Some defendants felt she had treated them unfairly. A few lawyers had filed formal grievances about her conduct. There were whispers about possible favoritism toward certain attorneys and harsh treatment of others. The Judicial Review Board had begun looking into these complaints, though nothing official had come of it yet. As the morning progressed, Judge Hawkins grew more impatient. She snapped at a lawyer who fumbled with his papers. She lectured a young woman about personal responsibility for 10 minutes over a minor traffic violation. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense. People shifted nervously in their seats, hoping their cases would be called soon so they could leave. Marcus noticed how differently Judge Hawkins treated various defendants. She showed more patience with well-dressed white defendants, while seeming annoyed by others before they even spoke. Her facial expressions changed depending on who stood before her. These subtle differences might go unnoticed by casual observers, but Marcus had spent years working with young people and was skilled at reading body language. The court reporter typed steadily at her machine, recording every word spoken. She had worked with Judge Hawkins for 5 years and had grown used to her behavior. Still, even she seemed uncomfortable this morning. She glanced up occasionally with a worried expression. Something about today felt different, though she could not quite put her finger on what it was. The court clerk finally called Marcus Thompson's case number, and he stood up smoothly, adjusting his tie. He walked to the defendant's table with confident steps, carrying his folder of evidence. Several people in the gallery watched him with interest. His professional appearance and calm demeanor stood out among the morning's defendants. Marcus placed his documents on the table and waited respectfully for the judge to acknowledge him. Judge Hawkins looked up from her papers, and her expression immediately changed. Her eyes narrowed as she studied Marcus from head to toe. She seemed to take in his neat appearance and professional bearing with obvious displeasure. Without even glancing at the case file, she began tapping her pen against the bench in an aggressive rhythm that echoed through the quiet courtroom. Before Marcus could speak, Judge Hawkins muttered something under her breath. The words were barely audible, but the court reporter caught them and paused her typing. She had said something about these people always having excuses. The comment hung in the air like a bad smell. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A lawyer in the front row raised his eyebrows in surprise. Marcus maintained his composure despite the judge's obvious hostility. He had faced discrimination before in his life and learned long ago that responding with anger only made things worse. Instead, he took a deep breath and began explaining his case in a clear, steady voice. He told the judge about the traffic light and mentioned the security camera footage he had obtained. Judge Hawkins interrupted him before he could finish his first sentence. She waved her hand dismissively and said she had heard all this before. Her tone dripped with sarcasm and contempt. She asked Marcus if he really expected the court to believe his story. The way she emphasized certain words made her meaning crystal clear to everyone listening. The bailiff standing near the door shifted his weight nervously. He had worked in this courtroom for 3 years and had seen Judge Hawkins lose her temper before, but this felt different. Her hostility toward Marcus seemed personal and vindictive. The bailiff glanced around the room and noticed others were having similar reactions. Even the court clerk had stopped typing to stare at the judge. Marcus tried again to present his evidence, but Judge Hawkins cut him off repeatedly. Each interruption became more aggressive than the last. She questioned his credibility and suggested he probably did not understand basic traffic laws. Her comments grew increasingly inappropriate, crossing the line from stern to outright offensive. The atmosphere in the courtroom turned electric with tension. Several people in the gallery began whispering to each other. A young woman in the back row took out her phone and started recording despite the signs prohibiting electronic devices. An elderly man shook his head in disgust. Two lawyers sitting together exchanged meaningful looks. Everyone could sense that something terrible was happening, but no one knew quite what to do about it. Judge Hawkins seemed oblivious to the reaction she was causing. Her anger appeared to feed on itself, growing stronger with each passing moment. She leaned forward in her chair and fixed Marcus with a cold stare. Her next words shocked even the most cynical courthouse veterans. She made a comment about people like him that was so obviously racist it left the entire room in stunned silence. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keyboard. She had typed many offensive things over the years, but this was beyond anything she had encountered before. She looked up at the judge with wide eyes, unable to believe what she had just heard. The bailiff took an involuntary step forward, as if he might intervene, but then stopped, unsure of his authority to challenge a sitting judge. Marcus stood perfectly still, absorbing the judge's words without flinching. His dignity in that moment was remarkable. He did not argue or protest. He simply looked at Judge Hawkins with calm, steady eyes that seemed to see right through her anger to the small, bitter person beneath. His silence spoke louder than any words could have. The heavy oak door at the back of the courtroom opened quietly, and Special Agent Carla Rodriguez slipped inside. She wore a simple gray suit that helped her blend in with the other professionals in the room. Her trained eyes quickly scanned the courtroom, taking in every detail. She chose an empty seat in the last row and settled in to observe. No one paid her any attention as she pulled out a small notebook and pen. Agent Rodriguez had been with the FBI's Civil Rights Division for 12 years. She specialized in investigating cases of judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. Her current assignment had brought her to this courtroom after months of careful investigation. The complaints against Judge Hawkins had been piling up, and her supervisors finally decided it was time for direct observation. The investigation had started 6 months ago with a single complaint from a defense attorney. He claimed Judge Hawkins had made discriminatory remarks during a sentencing hearing. More complaints followed, creating a pattern that could not be ignored. Agent Rodriguez had spent weeks reviewing court transcripts and interviewing witnesses. The evidence suggested a troubling pattern of bias in Judge Hawkins' courtroom. As she watched the proceedings, Agent Rodriguez noticed the tense atmosphere immediately. Judge Hawkins was berating a well-dressed black man at the defendant's table. The agent recognized the signs of judicial misconduct right away. She began taking detailed notes documenting everything she saw and heard. Her pen moved quickly across the page, capturing the judge's exact words and tone. Agent Rodriguez had seen many forms of discrimination during her career, but witnessing it from a sitting judge was particularly disturbing. Judges were supposed to represent blind justice, treating everyone equally under the law. When they violated that sacred trust, it undermined the entire legal system. She felt her jaw tighten as Judge Hawkins continued her verbal assault on the defendant. The FBI had been building a case against Judge Hawkins for months. They had gathered financial records that showed suspicious patterns. Several large deposits had appeared in her bank accounts that did not match her judicial salary. They had also found connections between the judge and certain lawyers who seemed to win more cases in her courtroom. The evidence pointed to possible corruption, but they needed more to make federal charges stick. Agent Rodriguez was not the only federal employee interested in Judge Hawkins. The Department of Justice had been monitoring her sentencing patterns using computer analysis. The data showed that Black and Hispanic defendants received harsher sentences in her courtroom compared to white defendants charged with similar crimes. The disparities were too large to be explained by chance alone. The agent's presence in the courtroom was part of a larger operation. Two other agents waited in a van outside the courthouse monitoring communications. Another agent sat in a car across the street with a clear view of the building's exits. They were prepared to act quickly if the situation warranted immediate intervention. The team had planned this operation carefully over several weeks. Agent Rodriguez felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She glanced at the message from her supervisor asking for a status update. She typed a quick response indicating that she was witnessing significant violations. Her supervisor replied immediately telling her to continue observing and document everything. The next few minutes would be crucial for their investigation. As Judge Hawkins's behavior grew worse, Agent Rodriguez made a decision. She had seen enough to justify taking action. The judge's comments had crossed every line of judicial ethics and possibly violated federal civil rights laws. The agent sent a coded message to her team outside telling them to prepare for her signal. She then returned her attention to the scene unfolding before her. The agent knew that arresting a sitting judge would cause a major scandal. The media would descend on the courthouse within hours. Questions would be asked about how Judge Hawkins had been allowed to remain on the bench for so long. The judicial system would face scrutiny and calls for reform, but none of that mattered compared to stopping the injustice happening right in front of her. Judge Hawkins leaned even further forward in her chair, glaring down at Marcus with undisguised contempt. Her face had turned red with anger, and the veins in her neck stood out prominently. She gripped the edge of her bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Several people pulled out their phones despite the rules against recording. The judge's voice grew louder and more shrill with each word she spoke. She accused Marcus of lying about the traffic light and suggested he was trying to game the system. Her language became increasingly unprofessional, using terms that had no place in a courtroom. She seemed to have forgotten where she was or that other people were watching. Her rage had taken complete control. Marcus continued to stand calmly at the defendant's table. His hands remained folded in front of him and his expression stayed neutral. He had dealt with angry people before through his work as a basketball coach. He knew that staying calm often diffused tense situations. But this was different. This was a judge who held power over his immediate future, acting completely out of control. The court clerk stopped pretending to type and stared openly at Judge Hawkins. She had worked in various courtrooms for 20 years and had never witnessed anything like this. Her fingers hovered uselessly over the keys as she tried to process what was happening. Part of her wanted to speak up, but she feared losing her job. The conflict showed clearly on her face. Other people in the gallery began to react more vocally to the judge's behavior. A man in the fifth row stood up as if to leave, then sat back down. A woman near the front gasped audibly at one particularly offensive comment. Two teenagers in the back started whispering furiously to each other. The quiet, orderly courtroom had transformed into a scene of barely controlled chaos. Judge Hawkins seemed energized by the reaction she was causing. She pointed her finger at Marcus and made an accusation that shocked even those who had witnessed her previous outbursts. She suggested that people of his background were naturally inclined to break the law. The racist implication was impossible to miss. Several people in the gallery stood up in protest. The bailiff took several steps toward the bench, then stopped. He had never faced a situation like this in his 5 years working courthouse security. His training covered dealing with unruly defendants but not out-of-control judges. He looked around for guidance but found none. The other court officers seemed equally frozen by the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. Marcus finally spoke, breaking his long silence. His voice was steady and dignified as he addressed the court. He said he had come seeking justice and fair treatment under the law. He had evidence to support his case and asked only for the chance to present it. His words were respectful but firm. He refused to be baited into an angry response despite the extreme provocation. Judge Hawkins exploded at Marcus's calm response. She slammed her gavel repeatedly, and shouted that she would find him in contempt if he spoke again without permission. Her face had turned almost purple with rage. Spittle flew from her mouth as she yelled. She looked more like someone having a breakdown than a respected member of the judiciary. The breaking point came when Judge Hawkins made her most shocking statement yet. She looked directly at Marcus and used a racial slur that had not been heard in a courtroom for decades. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Complete silence fell over the room as everyone processed what they had just heard. Even the judge seemed momentarily stunned by her own words. Agent Rodriguez closed her notebook and stood up in the back row. She had documented enough evidence to support federal charges. The judge had crossed every possible line of judicial conduct and violated multiple civil rights statutes. It was time to act. The agent reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her FBI badge. Everything was about to change. Agent Rodriguez moved with purpose down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her footsteps echoed in the stunned silence that followed Judge Hawkins' shocking words. Every eye in the room turned to watch the woman in the gray suit approaching the bench. She held her FBI badge high above her head so everyone could see it clearly. The gold shield caught the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. The agent's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos that had erupted moments before. She had participated in dozens of arrests during her career, but this was her first time arresting a sitting judge. Her training kicked in as she approached the bench. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, avoiding any sudden gestures that might escalate the situation further. Judge Hawkins's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. First confusion as she noticed someone approaching her bench without permission. Then irritation at what she assumed was another interruption to her authority. Finally recognition and fear as she saw the FBI badge and understood what it meant. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly much older. "Your Honor, I am Special Agent Rodriguez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division." The agent's voice was clear and professional, carrying easily throughout the courtroom. "I need you to step down from the bench immediately. You are under arrest for violations of federal civil rights laws and judicial misconduct. Please comply peacefully with my instructions." The courtroom erupted in excited whispers and gasps. People pulled out their phones to record the unprecedented scene. Several journalists who had been covering routine court cases suddenly found themselves witnessing the story of their careers. The bailiff stepped back from the bench, unsure whether to assist the FBI agent or protect the judge he had served for years. Judge Hawkins gripped the arms of her chair and shook her head violently. "This is preposterous," she sputtered, her voice cracking with panic. "You have no authority here. This is my courtroom. I demand you leave immediately, or I will hold you in contempt." Her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The power she had wielded so ruthlessly just moments before had evaporated like morning mist. Agent Rodriguez remained calm and professional. She had expected resistance and was prepared for it. "Ma'am, I have full federal authority to make this arrest. My team has been investigating your conduct for 6 months. We have extensive documentation of civil rights violations, corruption, and abuse of judicial power. Your behavior today toward Mr. Thompson was simply the final piece of evidence we needed." 2 additional FBI agents entered through the main courtroom doors. They wore dark suits and serious expressions as they moved to flank Agent Rodriguez. Their presence made it clear this was not a single agent acting alone, but a coordinated federal operation. The reality of her situation began to sink in for Judge Hawkins. Her shoulders slumped and her defiant expression crumbled. Marcus Thompson remained standing at the defendant's table, watching the scene unfold with amazement. He had come to court expecting to argue about a traffic ticket. Instead, he had become a witness to one of the most dramatic arrests in the courthouse's history. He felt a mixture of vindication and sympathy as he watched the judge who had just humiliated him being taken into custody. The court clerk began typing furiously, trying to create an official record of these extraordinary events. Her fingers flew over the keys as she documented every word and action. She knew this transcript would be studied and analyzed for years to come. This was the kind of moment that defined careers and changed institutions. She was determined to capture every detail accurately. Agent Rodriguez nodded to her colleagues who moved toward the bench. "Judge Patricia Hawkins, please stand and place your hands behind your back. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The familiar words of the Miranda warning echoed through the courtroom as justice finally caught up with Judge Patricia Hawkins. 6 months after the dramatic arrest, the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was packed for Judge Patricia Hawkins' sentencing. The same courtroom where she had once wielded absolute power now hosted her final humiliation. She sat at the defendant's table wearing a gray jumpsuit instead of black robes. Her hair had turned completely white during the months in custody, and her face showed the strain of her fall from grace. The federal judge presiding over her case spoke solemnly about the damage she had caused to the justice system. He noted that judges were given tremendous power and trust by society. When they violated that trust, they undermined public faith in the rule of law. He sentenced Patricia Hawkins to 12 years in federal prison for her crimes. She would serve her time in the same facility where she had sent so many others. Marcus Thompson attended the sentencing sitting quietly in the gallery. He felt no satisfaction seeing his former tormentor receive her punishment. Instead, he focused on the positive changes that had come from that terrible morning 6 months ago. His traffic ticket had been dismissed immediately, and he had returned to his normal life. But the experience had changed him, inspiring a new mission to fight for equal justice. The Marcus Thompson Foundation for Judicial Reform was established 3 months after the incident. Marcus used money from a civil settlement against the courthouse to fund the organization. The foundation provided free legal assistance to people who had been victims of judicial bias. It also lobbied for stronger oversight of judges and mandatory bias training. Within its first year, the foundation helped over 300 people challenge unfair sentences. The ripple effects of Judge Hawkins' arrest spread throughout the Georgia legal system. 3 other judges resigned after their own patterns of bias were exposed. Dozens of cases were reviewed and overturned. People who had been given excessive sentences by biased judges were released from prison. The state legislature passed new laws requiring regular judicial reviews and creating an independent commission to investigate complaints. Judge Hawkins' former colleagues distanced themselves from her after details of her corruption emerged. Some claimed they had suspected something was wrong, but had been afraid to speak up. Others expressed shock that someone they had worked with for years could harbor such prejudice. The legal community engaged in soul-searching about how to prevent similar situations in the future. A new judge was appointed to Courtroom 3, bringing a completely different atmosphere to the space. Judge Maria Santos was known for her fairness and compassion. She treated every defendant with respect, regardless of their background. Under her leadership, the courtroom became a model for how justice should be administered. Court staff who had worked under Judge Hawkins expressed relief at the positive change. Marcus continued coaching youth basketball while running his foundation. He often spoke to his players about the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. He shared his courthouse experience as a lesson about maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. Many of his players went on to become advocates for social justice in their own communities, inspired by their coach's example. The FBI's Civil Rights Division used the Hawkins case as a training example for new agents. Agent Rodriguez received a commendation for her handling of the investigation and arrest. She continued working to root out corruption and bias in the justice system. The case proved that no one was above the law and that federal authorities would act decisively to protect civil rights. Years later, legal scholars would point to the Hawkins case as a turning point in judicial accountability. It demonstrated that the system could correct itself when good people were willing to act. Marcus Thompson's grace under pressure became legendary in legal circles. His story reminded everyone that sometimes the worst injustices could lead to the most meaningful reforms. The courthouse steps where Marcus had walked that fateful morning now bore a plaque honoring those who fought for equal justice under law. Judge Hawkins stood up slowly from her chair, her legs shaking beneath her black robes. The FBI agents moved around the bench, approaching her from both sides. She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, realizing that resistance was futile. Years of wielding absolute power in her courtroom had ended in this moment of complete humiliation. Tears began to form in her eyes as the reality of her situation sank in. The agents were professional and respectful despite the judge's earlier behavior. They asked her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Everyone watched in disbelief as the woman who had terrorized defendants for years was now in the same position she had put so many others. The irony was lost on no one present. Agent Rodriguez continued reading the Miranda rights while her colleagues secured Judge Hawkins. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you? Judge Hawkins nodded, mutely unable to speak. Her earlier rage had been replaced by shock and fear. She knew better than anyone what happened to people who violated federal law. The court officers stood frozen, unsure of their role in this unprecedented situation. They had sworn to protect the judge and maintain order in her courtroom. Now federal agents were arresting her in front of everyone. The bailiff finally moved to open the side door that led to the courthouse holding cells. He had escorted hundreds of defendants through that door, but never imagined a judge would make the same journey. Word of the arrest spread quickly through the courthouse. Staff members from other courtrooms came to peek through the windows. Lawyers abandoned their cases to witness history in the making. Within minutes, the hallway outside courtroom 3 was packed with curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to see the notorious Judge Hawkins being led away in handcuffs. Some felt satisfaction, while others expressed shock. Agent Rodriguez spoke to the stunned courtroom, while her colleagues prepared to escort Judge Hawkins out. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the disruption to your morning. This arrest is the result of a lengthy federal investigation into judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. All cases scheduled in this courtroom today will be rescheduled. You will receive notification of your new court dates by mail. The journalists present began making phone calls to their editors. This was front-page news that would dominate headlines for days. A sitting judge arrested by the FBI for racist behavior and corruption was unprecedented in the city's history. News vans were already racing toward the courthouse. By evening, the story would be on every major network and news website across the country. Marcus Thompson remained at the defendant's table processing what he had just witnessed. He had come to fight a simple traffic ticket, and instead became the catalyst for exposing judicial corruption. He felt no joy in seeing Judge Hawkins arrested despite her cruel treatment of him. He understood that this moment was bigger than his personal experience. It was about justice and accountability in the legal system. The FBI agents began leading Judge Hawkins toward the door. She shuffled along in her handcuffs, looking small and defeated. Her expensive robes dragged on the floor as she walked. The woman who had entered the courtroom with such authority that morning was leaving as a criminal defendant. Court staff watched in silence as she passed. Some felt sympathy while others remembered her harsh treatment over the years. As Judge Hawkins reached the doorway, she turned to look back at the courtroom one last time. Her eyes met Marcus Thompson's across the room. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Perhaps it was understanding, or maybe regret. Then the agents guided her through the door, and she was gone. The heavy door closed with a final thud that seemed to echo the end of an era. The courtroom remained silent for several moments after Judge Hawkins disappeared through the door. People looked at each other with expressions of shock and disbelief. Some began gathering their belongings to leave, while others stayed seated hoping to learn more about what had just happened. The court clerk saved her work and began shutting down her computer, knowing the day's proceedings were effectively over. Agent Rodriguez turned to address Marcus Thompson, who still stood at the defendant's table. Mr. Thompson, I want to apologize for what you experienced here today. No citizen should ever be subjected to such treatment in an American courtroom. Your dignity and composure in the face of blatant discrimination was remarkable. The FBI will need your statement as part of our investigation. Are you willing to cooperate with us? Marcus nodded immediately. Absolutely, Agent Rodriguez. I came here seeking justice, and it seems I found it in an unexpected way. I will do whatever I can to help ensure this never happens to anyone else." His voice was steady and strong. The experience had shaken him, but also reinforced his belief that standing up to injustice was always the right choice, even when it seemed hopeless. Within an hour, the courthouse was surrounded by news vans and reporters. The story of Judge Hawkins' arrest spread like wildfire through social media. Cell phone videos of her racist remarks and subsequent arrest were already going viral. Legal experts appeared on television to discuss the implications of a federal judge being arrested for civil rights violations. The scandal dominated the news cycle for days. The FBI's investigation revealed the full extent of Judge Hawkins' corruption. She had accepted over $200,000 in bribes from certain lawyers who regularly appeared in her courtroom. In exchange, she had given their clients lighter sentences or dismissed charges entirely. The pattern of discrimination in her sentencing was even worse than initially suspected. Black defendants had received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. The Judicial Review Board launched its own investigation into how Judge Hawkins had been allowed to continue serving despite numerous complaints. They discovered that several complaints had been buried or ignored by courthouse administrators. Some staff members had been too intimidated to speak up, while others had been paid to keep quiet. The corruption extended beyond just one bad judge to a system that had failed to provide proper oversight. Marcus Thompson became an unexpected celebrity in the days following the arrest. His calm response to Judge Hawkins' abuse was praised by civil rights leaders and legal scholars. He appeared on several news programs to share his story, but always redirected attention to the larger issues of systemic bias in the justice system. He used his platform to advocate for judicial reform and better oversight of sitting judges. The local bar association held emergency meetings to discuss the scandal. Many lawyers came forward with their own stories of experiencing or witnessing bias in Judge Hawkins' courtroom. Some admitted they had been afraid to file complaints, fearing retaliation that could damage their careers. The legal community began developing new protocols for reporting judicial misconduct and protecting whistleblowers who spoke up. 3 weeks after her arrest, Judge Hawkins was formally indicted on federal charges including civil rights violations, corruption, bribery, and abuse of power. She faced up to 20 years in prison if convicted on all counts. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but federal prosecutors refused to offer anything less than significant jail time. They wanted to send a clear message that no one was above the law. The courthouse implemented immediate changes in response to the scandal. All judges were required to undergo bias training and civil rights education. A new anonymous complaint system was established, allowing anyone to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Court proceedings would now be randomly audited by independent observers. The dark cloud of Judge Hawkins' reign had finally lifted from Courtroom 3.